this afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started. And while I start us out on introductions, I'm just going to remind everyone we're in meeting mode. So you are responsible for muting and unmuting yourself if you're going to share or ask a question later in the webinar. My name is Gina Capito. I'm with Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies, co-led with my colleague Simon Workman, who will introduce himself here in a couple minutes. We are very excited to be launching the last in our 6-part webinar series because this particular webinar was started out as a case study, and as we really gelled all the content together across the other 5 webinars, which is really bringing to light the comprehensive approach to fiscal strategies work, we saw emerging an opportunity to really highlight a single example with a state, and that's the state of New Mexico. And we are honored to have several state leaders from New Mexico here with us today as speakers, and to pull together the comprehensive approach in a really hands-on way with this one example and unpacking all the components of this one example. So Simon and I are going to be a much lighter touch today because we really want to cede the floor to Secretary Groginsky from New Mexico, who's joined by Assistant Secretary Archuleta. And we will be introducing their roles in a little more detail here in a second. We just want to offer a bit of framing from the content, pulling all of our pieces of our webinar series together. So here you are seated in webinar number 6 and the case study focusing on New Mexico's comprehensive approach. Just a quick reminder, all of the webinar recordings, slide decks, and any resources that are related to the events are always available at the Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies website. And the links there, we'll also throw it in the chat in a little bit so you can follow that at any time. What we're going to focus on today, as I mentioned, is just a quick pulling together and linking this content to the overarching frame that we've been working through across all of the webinars and all of the Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies resources. And then we're going to move into hearing directly from New Mexico and how they fit within all the pieces of the work. And then we're going to talk just briefly at the very end about next steps and an opportunity to sign up for office hours to kind of debrief and learn more about your individual context and ways that you can implement some of this work. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Simon to talk to us more about content.
Thanks, Gina. Hi, everyone. This is Simon Workman with the Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies team. It is great to see lots of familiar names who've been with us throughout the 6 webinars, and as well as some new names. So excited to have you all with us today to join us for this conversation. As Gina said, we really decided to have New Mexico as the case study for today because they really embody all of the concepts that we've been discussing throughout the series under this comprehensive frame. And that's not to say that they have completed all the work. It's very much still a work in progress, which I think they would be the first to acknowledge, but they are really tackling it in the comprehensive way that we've been talking to across these series of webinars. And just to kind of get us started, I wanted to show the comprehensive approach slide that we've shown at all of these webinars. So if you have been on these webinars, this will be very familiar to you. If it's the first time seeing it, I encourage you to go back and look at webinar 1 for a deeper dive on this. But a reminder of the approach of this, because we're going to be spending so much time on it today. The idea of this is that the fiscal, equity, and governance analysis that all exist there in those blue cogs on the left, they're all working in tandem together. So the changes that are being made on fiscal have an equity impact, have a governance impact. You want to make changes to the equity approach of your system, make it a more equitable system. You have to be looking at the governance and the fiscal. They all are intertwined, and they're all also informed, or should be informed, by really intentional stakeholder engagement, right? That is the orange arrows that are on this graphic here, making sure that new, diverse voices are brought to the table so that these conversations and these analyses are not just happening in a vacuum, and encouraging people to really think about who is involved in those conversations and who is really being brought into the table. And we're going to be digging into that a little bit more today to hear how New Mexico did that. And of course, all of that happening in service of this comprehensive fiscal approach that has an impact on the way policy, program, and practice really happens, all to the end goal of this vision of a comprehensive Prenatal to 5 system. So as we kind of listen to New Mexico's experience today, I just want to, you have this frame in your mind, and thinking about, how New Mexico was able to take these 3 different analyses and these different areas in the cogs to really develop this comprehensive fiscal approach, which is driving all of the work that they are doing. And then next, just a reminder of our principles, the principles that are undergirding all of this work and that we've shown you before. And these are really principles that New Mexico has embraced. And when we look at these principles that we stood up and look at what New Mexico is doing, and as you hear the Secretary and the Assistant Secretary talk in a little bit, you'll see there's a lot of overlap with these. You know, this idea that we have a system that works for all children, that is fair to providers and is supporting their professional growth, that is making efficient use of public resources, is acknowledging and remediating the embedded inequities in the system, and making sure that it's compensating the workforce adequately. And then finally, supporting the entirety of a child's experience before they enter kindergarten, really covering all of these 6 principles in all of the work we're doing to get to that end vision goal. So with that level of framing, I'm going to turn it over to Gina now, who's going to start walking us through some of the content and introduce our guest speakers today.
Thanks, Simon. I'm going to highlight one thing that we've shared a couple times in relationship to the principles and the vision and the overall comprehensive frame is this idea of systems building. Because I think as you're really listening to the examples built out in New Mexico's work, what you're going to hear as a consistent theme is the focus on systems change and the interplay of the elements of a system and how critical that is to making the sort of sweeping change that New Mexico has made, from governance to their fiscal strategies to embedding equity throughout all of their work and having it actually drive their governance and fiscal strategies changes, that really there is the interplay of all the components of a system are such a critical piece of it. So I bring this back up as a bit of a reminder of that, because I really believe as we move into the New Mexico example that the stakeholder engagement and how we move the cogs and how it's about systems change that's actually moving the cogs is going to become even more overt as you're really hearing from and thinking about the example. While we focus on primarily governance and administration, or the shared leadership component of a system, and then the financing and funding mechanisms, we know that all of that work really is somewhat of a foundation systemically for things like monitoring and accountability, the quality implementation of services, how we ensure that we have the services in communities that meet families' needs and are really responsive to the needs of given children and families. So the interplay of the components of a system is critical. And we just highlight that while we're focusing on governance and fiscal, you certainly are always thinking about the other elements of your system at the same time as well, and you're working on that. And I think you're going to hear that from our colleagues in New Mexico as we move into the work. And so with that, I actually want to begin introductions to both of our guest speakers today. The comprehensive approach, and as Simon mentioned, it relates directly to the cogs, and we're going to think more about how that interplays together. But we have 2 speakers joining us to support us in that work. And we're going to remind you of the fact that we actually shared a pre-diagram for New Mexico's system on our governance webinar. And this is really an opportunity to really understand the post that now that folks are operating within. And so our first speaker is Secretary Elizabeth Groginsky, and Elizabeth is the Cabinet Secretary for the newly formed Early Care and Education Department in the state of New Mexico. Elizabeth is joined by Assistant Secretary Jovanna Archuleta, as I mentioned, and Jovanna is the Assistant Secretary for Native American Early Education and Care. And they're both going to bring their robust engagement in this deep systems change to our work and really help us understand what that work looks like to be moving these cogs, and what those those orange arrows that you see here, what that actual work looks like at play in a state. As I mentioned, I was going to share the idea of how we make governance changes. So we're going to be starting there in the green cog first, starting out with thinking about how the work of those changes looks. And so, as I mentioned, we shared a couple webinars ago. In case you weren't there, we're doing it as a quick reminder. We sort of start with the idea of what was the problem that New Mexico was solving for with the formation of a new department. And so part of what we want to share with this before I turn it over to Secretary Groginsky is to remind you of the old approach to governance and where early care and education services sat within the state of New Mexico. So it really is in this Department of Youth, Children, Youth, and Families, with 2 divisions underneath that, the Office of Child Development, Early Childhood Services, and the Office of Child Development, Home Visiting. And you see within this org chart which programs or funding streams were then administered by those different offices and how it was originally structured and has been structured for the last at least a couple of decades within the state of New Mexico. And so when we think a little bit about, and Elizabeth's going to put more color to the idea of what the problem statement is around this sort of formation and how moving in a new direction for the state of New Mexico has opened up so many opportunities for them to really focus on new revenue generation and how they actually implement their funding and focus on equity for children and families. So with that, I'm going to invite Secretary Groginsky to join us.
Okay. Thank you, Gina. Thank you, Simon. It's great to be here with everybody to talk about these three important cogs: governance, financing, and equity. So as Gina shared, it was so interesting when we put this together. I had not seen that slide before, so it was really powerful to see what has occurred. And just for context, for those of you on the call, I've been here since December of 2019. So a lot of this great work, I really have to credit to many people before me, and really to Governor Lujan Grisham and her cabinet, because she put this as a top priority to take the work that had happened in New Mexico over a decade. Legislators introducing bills saying we have to better align, we have to better coordinate early childhood services. And she said, this is going to be the first thing I do in my first month, 2 months on the job as a new governor. And her director of the Children's Cabinet, which she also reestablished under her leadership, Mariana Padilla, really deserve a lot of credit for bringing the advocates, the legislators, the department heads together in service of bringing together Senate Bill 22, which we fondly referred to as the bill that created the New Mexico Early Childhood Education and Care Department. A lot of thought went into this, again, from all of those stakeholders. And they said, we have to bring these programs together, primarily from the Department of Health and the Children, Youth, and Families Department. But also we had New Mexico Pre-K, both being administered through the Public Education Department and through the Children, Youth, and Families Department. So all of these programs you see here, from childcare to the Head Start State Collaboration, and a very important program, Families First, which is a perinatal case management program operated and delivered by nurses in the state. So what a great opportunity. The family nutrition programs, that's our child and adult care food program, our summer food service program, all of this coming under one roof, sitting at that cabinet table, thinking about how we can better govern and align our services and supports for families and young children. So again, this started July 1st. Just remember, the pandemic started March and our department did not launch until July 1. So in all of this context, a lot of credit goes to the governor and her leadership. And just to say, all the cabinet secretaries were at every committee hearing saying, this is essential. We need this department. We have to do more for children and families early on. And it's too challenging with all the different governance structures in each of the departments. So they were at every committee hearing in full support of this creation of the new department. But that was the first and important act. And in Senate Bill 22, we'll talk about some of the critical aspects that were in that bill that I think have led to our early successes. If you go to the next slide, Gina. One thing, and I want to thank the Hunt Institute, actually reached out and said, wow, you've got a big job. You're coming together to bring this whole new department. And so they helped me set up a transition committee. And this was really important. These are, I'll talk just briefly about some of the guiding voices that helped us take this amazing piece of legislation and this new creation of a department and make sure that we were focused on meeting the needs of all families and young children across the state. And so this transition committee were made up of legislators, of the cabinet secretaries that are part of the Children's Cabinet. We had Harriet Dichter and Bibi Otero as two great national experts in early childhood system work. We had state leaders in business and education that served on this committee, and the governor's office. And we worked away and really were able to think about how to make sure this department in its first 18 months takes the critical action that we need to take. We also had the good fortune of having the New Mexico statewide early childhood strategic plan underway. We building that off of our needs assessment, where we had over 4,700 engagements, whether it was through surveys, focus groups, in-person activities. So these were some of the voices that were guiding our thinking and our decision-making. And then an advisory council mandated in Senate Bill 22 that said, you need to make sure this department is informed by community leaders, people from the community who are engaged with and part of all these different programs and services that are now in your department. So we had 300 people apply. We selected 41 people to participate. And again, across the state, rural, urban, home visiting, early childhood, higher ed. And again, their voices, we just released the report today and their recommendations and mandates. So that's exciting. Pritzker Children's Initiative, it's been so helpful to have a steering committee of people thinking about the prenatal to 3 period, having that support. And again, all the stakeholders in Medicaid, home visiting, childcare, infant toddler focus has been really important part. I've mentioned the Children's Cabinet, and then Assistant Secretary Archuleta will talk more about our government to government relations and how that has helped inform and guide our work. So through all of these voices and through all these conversations and all this amazing engagement with community members and leaders at all levels, the department has really honed in on these 5 strategic priorities. We know that our goals and our objectives may change over the coming years, but these 5 are critical. Growing investments, I'll talk more about that as we look at the financing strategies. We're 50th in child well-being, we're 49th in child poverty, we're 50th in child hunger. We know that we will not get the results we want for all families and children in New Mexico unless there is a greater and more significant investment. Second, we have to use those investments to really advance a diverse and well-compensated credentialed workforce. This is essential. We know that those individuals are what are going to increase our quality, and that again, the investments are going to help us create more access all throughout the state. Achieving equity. We have a very amazingly diverse and rich state. Not all families and children across our state have access to these programs, and we have to really be thinking with them. And that really falls to the 5th strategic priority is we have to be engaged actively with our communities. We have historically, our Native American, our Hispanic, our Spanish-speaking populations have not been at the table. They've not been part of the decision-making, and we need to make sure that that is how our department operates and that we really engage families and providers at a very deep and meaningful level. So with that, I do want to, I think my next slide, and of course, families and young children are at our center, as I am so pleased to introduce the first in the nation, first in New Mexico, Assistant Secretary Archuleta, Assistant Secretary for Native American Early Education and Care. She joined me probably a month or 2 after, and I think maybe a days before the pandemic hit. So I'm very excited to introduce her to so many of you and for you to hear some of the great work that she's helping the department lead.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jovanna Archuleta. I can say a highlight from the start of the pandemic was I got to watch my then 1-year-old, now 2-year-old, soon to be 3-year-old grow and be her teacher during that time. So I just want to dovetail off what Secretary Groginsky mentioned. We are also looking at our financing and investing in local Indigenous knowledge systems that have been working in our state for a long time. So we continue to support the workforce to have that culturally appropriate and responsive education. So as Secretary mentioned, and I'm sorry, I have to go by my notes. If you can go to the next slide, Gina. Some of our strategic plan guiding principles, and to Simon's point, the principles that work for all children, were developed in 3 categories, which is equitable access. That's celebrating, healing, and prioritizing resources for those greatest in need. And I feel that we have this opportunity through our children to heal historical and generational trauma. So I'm excited as we continue to do this work across our state. Coordination and collaboration, just building on the strengths and local knowledge through clear, consistent, transparent communication to build those collaborative relationships. And then quality, just to embrace CQI, to use developmentally appropriate approaches and culturally relevant approaches when working with families and young children. Support for the early childhood educators, and just to ensure best practices as we go forward. Thank you. So as Secretary mentioned, I am the first. I still have to get used to that as we continue to build out this position and make it successful for all of our 23 tribes, pueblos, and nations. This is really their position. I just am here to share their voice. So some of the work we've done to just move some of these actions into reality is elevate 9 tribal liaisons within our department, and that includes having representation from home visiting, from New Mexico Pre-K, from all of the divisions that Secretary mentioned, to come together. We meet once a month to work towards a really unified communication and consultation policy on how we do the next item, which is state tribal consultation. We have started our consultation with tribal communities. We are thankful for the pueblos that have opened their doors to us, virtually opened their doors to us, to just, one, we provided guidance, awareness of our new department, being that we're 9 months old now, tomorrow, and to gain their guidance on how we govern and support self-governance and financial support to the 23 pueblos, tribes, and nations. And through some of this work, and in the nine months that we've been a state agency, we had a conversation with the New Mexico Head Start Association, which really sparked this idea of an equity council and how we move towards really enhancing equity, as Secretary mentioned. Our journey has started. We started in the new year. And looking at the process, if Gina, you can go to the next slide, we're using this stakeholder engagement process. And I saw a presentation by 2 women during a Navajo Nation early childhood conference. Through their amazing facilitation and our stars aligned, they are now assisting us to collect our thoughts and ideas and move us through this process. So if you look at the stakeholder engagement process, we are currently just in the who. We are looking at who we need to bring into really looking at our beliefs. We have started internally. So we have about 9 members from within our department, including Secretary and myself, to talk about our own individual journeys, our own biases, our own social injustices, just to, create that relationship and safe space within our own department. We have now moved into bringing in external partners. And these are key stakeholders that we've looked at. We went through a list with all of our internal stakeholders, and they did one-on-one interviews. And based on those one-on-one interviews, they brought in some common themes. The facilitators produced some common themes of what they've said, and we've already begun to make changes just in that small window that we've started. We will then move into the why to help people see the system we are trying to change. We'll move into the what of co-creating solutions together, and hopefully at this point start to change our behaviors. And then we'll look at the how of how to redesign the system. So I look forward to our work. It has been, I can tell you that these meetings are my most favorite meetings to attend, and our next one is tomorrow. We continue just to strategize on how we get the voices of the providers and then the parents into our equity journey. Pritzker, as Secretary mentioned, is also has an equity group who will develop guidelines, guiding principles, which we will adopt to align with our work as well. Our hope is that this equity process will then transform and generate into regional equity councils who would also go through the same process to then just inform us as a new department on policies, on funding, on governance to support those children and communities that are most in need.
Jovanna, I know that there's so much work in the area of equity and some of the what and the how in particular is being informed by just even the initial convenings, right? So I think there's a few things I would like to have you tell us a little bit more about as you're in any implementation, you're starting to work on real product, right? Along with the convening of individuals to the table. So it comes to mind the Sowing Seeds curriculum initiative and how that has built up and how it's come from this input and what impact it's going to have on this element of really focusing with equity-driven change.
Sure. So as I said, as we celebrate language and culture in our Native American communities, the Sowing Seeds curriculum project is an 8 digital lesson. It's a capacity building workshop, which starts to bring together community members within those individual pueblos to look at visions, to look at a team that would help create curriculum. Oftentimes curriculum is created that communities have to adopt or adapt to, and this is an opportunity for tribal communities to build that capacity and create a plan on how they would then create their own individual curriculum with their values, with their language, and their own teaching mechanisms.
That's such a critical point of thinking about, and why I wanted to raise in the beginning the idea that while we might be thinking about governance and fiscal strategies, work in this area uncovers other things. And that idea of just it being forced to adopt a curriculum, especially when we're focusing on the delivery of evidence-based programming to children and families, it really starts to take away the ownership of the culture and the communities that are actually serving the children and families. And so giving them a space to actually build and be leaders in that curriculum development is such a piece that folks would maybe say is just an element of program implementation, but it was driven by a difference in approach to governance, right? That kind of brought about how this could be a critical function of what your system actually does. So I'm really impressed by that. I was also thinking about how you've approached your state and tribal consultation work and how that's been approached differently than just what's sort of required of you as a state entity to focus on that work. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. I think in my previous work, I've learned and sat with tribal leaders on what works and doesn't work. And I often see that tribal leaders are very busy and they need time. So as long as we are producing information well in advance for them to have the opportunity to provide authentic guidance and comments and questions, that is what we are doing. We are creating these informational guides that go out to tribal leaders and give them well enough time to make those comments and recommendations to us, and then consider how we can improve our system based on their knowledge as well.
If I could just add, the briefs that the Assistant Secretary has put together are awesome, and they include, where are family, infant, toddler programs? Those are our Part C providers. Where are pre-K programs, where are home visiting programs, all within the vicinity of the area, the geographic area around the Pueblo tribe or nation. And so it's been really great. I think on both sides, we've been able to see from our governance side where we have programs and where we have services, and then to really engage to her point that they can see, oh, wow, I either didn't know these programs were there, or there aren't any programs in this area. And then that helps us think government to government about how we can build sustainable systems. And in our tribal communities, sometimes elections are every year. So we're really thinking deeply about how do we create a governance, a system of governance and then financing that can build on that capacity year to year, so that they don't have to start over, but that we're able to put systems. So it's all, we're growing and learning, but I really want to, credit Assistant Secretary Archuleta for thinking about these important steps in advance to further and deepen our consultation.
Yes, definitely. And we develop an agenda based on our strategic priorities. So that's how we are transferring knowledge to them about our department.
Right, and anchor back to those strategic priorities as part of the frame.
Yes. I think
Jovanna,
that's it.
The one other area that I was thinking a little bit about that I think builds on this idea of how, when you're embedding equity, how are you really responsive to what the all of the stakeholders and voices that you're trying to ensure that you're really hearing from, like the pace at which they move. I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on the Indian Education Advisory Body. I know that's a role that you fill for the state, but then also that's an advisory body into the state system. And so really understanding the intersection of those two could be useful for folks in thinking about their governance systems.
Sure. So through Senate Bill 22, the Indian Education Advisory Council was placed as one of our advisory bodies. The Indian Education Advisory Council was first in place for public education. And so we're excited that they now advise us, and we participate in quarterly meetings on best practices, how we need to improve our system, being that we're only 9 months old, how we can continue to learn from these individuals who have been nominated by their tribal communities and appointed by Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham onto this council. So we're excited that we do have new leadership in the council. It was just decided in this new year. One thing that we're looking to do with this Indian Education Advisory Council is to get an early childhood expert, because it was very K through 12 focused. And so just having their expertise, I mean, they live in the communities, they come from their communities, and the body is all made up of tribal individuals. So they have that knowledge and expertise they can transfer to us. It's just, we need that early childhood expert as we go forward.
Secretary, did you want to add?
No, that was great. Thank you.
Jovanna, we're close to pivoting to the fiscal strategies cog, but I wanted to ensure that from your vantage point of this work over the last 9 months, if you had any additional reflections on this approach to embedding equity.
I think we definitely need to get to our parents who are, often on this other end of this delivery of services. We need to hear from them on what works, because they are truly the experts of their children and how they work in this system. And so once we get to finish our discovery internally, I hope that they can help us see the system versus instead of vice versa. So thank you, Gina. And any questions, I'm open to any questions. I see some coming up in the chat that I'll start to respond to as we transfer back over to you, Gina.
Right, we should have encouraged, and I apologize that we didn't encourage earlier, that please do be asking questions for us along the way. While I turn it over to Simon to take us away into more of the fiscal cog, I just want to highlight that the last thing that we are doing is making a distinction between equity and fiscal, because I think one of the things that we actually find is that how we finance things and where we don't put money is such a statement to what we think about equity and think about making actual equity changes. And this is another reason why the New Mexico example is such a testament to all the pieces coming together, because of their deep fiscal work informed by equity. So with that, I want to make sure that I did not leave you thinking that like we're closing an equity door, now we're talking fiscal. These things are actually linked together. Now I'll turn it over to Simon to take us away deeper into the cog.
Thanks, Gina. Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I think the point the Assistant Secretary just left us on there of saying, engaging with the parents kind of gets to exactly kind of what we've been talking about across this whole thing, right? It's like all of this work can happen, but it's so much better when, like, fiscal work, a lot of the fiscal work we have done over the years, you can build a cost model, you can build a fiscal model, but for it to actually have the change you want it to make and to have the impact on things like equitable access to services, you have to be engaging with the stakeholders, with the people who are actually, impacted by the policies, impacted by the changes. And that is both thinking about, who are those individuals, right? It's the providers, it's the parents and the families, but it's also, it's the communities that get left behind, right? It's making sure we're talking to the Native American communities, we're talking to the communities of color, we're talking to the rural communities, and really being intentional about thinking about who is at the table and who is not at the table. And I think what's so exciting in New Mexico is to see that you very intentionally, develop this position of an Assistant Secretary of Native American Education to make sure there is a clear, strong voice right there at that level, which is exciting. So in terms of the fiscal strategies for change, one of those real ways that I think we found in New Mexico that the state was really interested in in reimagining that, the approach was to think about the fiscal approach and to think about, how are all these things interplaying? If we think back to the COGS, how are the fiscal policies in the state right now, either being a driver of equity or a driver of inequity, right? And how can we sort of make some changes to the fiscal picture to make, when you think about one of those principles of remediating some of the inequities. So New Mexico actually launched a fiscal modeling project to better understand all these deficiencies of the system, to understand where the gap was between where they were right now and where they wanted to go, as well as helping identify how much revenue was needed to actually support this work. As we heard, the governor had a big vision for early childhood, and it was something that she's been was part of her campaign, and then was something one of priority when she came in. And having the department is really key. But we all know you need to understand how much it costs to do what you want to do, and how are you gonna get that money. So we have actually been, as Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies, we have been supporting the state through the department, but also through Growing Up New Mexico, an advocacy organization in the state, on a comprehensive modeling project, which, those of you who've been in our webinars have probably seen a version of this slide before, where, when we talk about comprehensive modeling, we are focused on 3 areas. It's this childcare modeling, which is kind of the traditional kind of, say traditional, but understanding what it costs to provide high quality early care and education, in a traditional childcare setting, in the center-based or home-based. But then also the home visiting and parent education modeling to really understand, that full suite of services. And when we think back to the principles that we also want to sort of say, everything impacting young children and families, making sure the system for home visiting and parent education is, the fiscal implications of that are fully understood. And then finally, the full systems-wide approach. If we are talking about making the fundamental change that New Mexico is, you need those supports for providers. If more providers are going to be accessing high quality, the supports to help them, with that continuous quality improvement, with the family engagement activities, etc., become really important as well. And so, we have been mostly focused in at least the most recent months on the childcare cost modeling, because as a lot of you in the States will know, there is a requirement to put in your CCDBG, CCDF plan this summer. And New Mexico has been very interested in using the childcare modeling data to rethink how they are setting subsidy rates in the state. And I want to turn it over to Secretary Groginsky right now to talk a bit more about why that was an important thing they wanted to do, and what they are hoping to do with the results from that.
Thank you, Simon. Yes, so those of you who may know me a little bit, I was in DC before I came to New Mexico, and had the opportunity to do the cost estimation model there. And just, based on that experience coming to New Mexico, immediately hearing from providers different concerns and challenges about what we were currently paying and what they were actually costing them. I think we all as early childhood individuals know about the market rate, and that the market rate does give us information about what people can pay. But then when we think about equity, then again, it is oftentimes embedding those inequities that we see in the system. So as is outlined here, our lower income areas sometimes have lower rates than the higher income areas. And then we see this just driving all kinds of inequities, whether it's childcare deserts or families not having access to the highest quality care across different settings. Also, many providers not wanting to engage in the system if those rates aren't actually able to support the true cost of care and the wages. So I have just, I'm a big proponent of it because of the kind of visibility that it brings to our industry, to the childcare industry. And again, if all families could afford $1,200, $1,500 a month for their infant to be in care, and they were all paying that, the market rate would do well, and people could pay that. But we know that that is in fact not true, and that there's a lot of inequities, not only in the price component piece, but also just within how the whole system is designed. So the cost estimation model, the work we've been doing with Gina and Simon through the Pritzker and the Growing Up New Mexico is really helping us think about the structure of childcare delivery in New Mexico in a really holistic way: age of children, type of setting, level of quality of that care. And we hope to really drive higher compensation, higher quality, and more providers really engaging in the system by conducting a cost estimation model. Anything else?
That's great. And, we have talked about, when you think about the equity piece and the stakeholder engagement, that is something that we were very intentional about in terms of the data collection and the work being guided by that intentional stakeholder engagement across the state.
Exactly. And I can just say that I know we've done, we had about 149 providers at our first kickoff to just say, hey, this is what we're going to do. And people are kind of overwhelmed by how much information they're getting. And I heard from some providers yesterday, because we had another follow-up saying, this is just fantastic. And I think a couple other things the cost estimation allows you to do is to demonstrate that you really understand the industry. You understand what the drivers are, what their cost drivers are, where their revenue streams come from. And it really builds, I think, a stronger connection between you as a state and providers in rural part of New Mexico, in a family child care home, as a large center in an urban setting. You can really speak to them, because through the cost estimation model, you're really you're telling their story. And they have been, we had 47 people, I think, on the call yesterday, 42 people, and really just absorbing what this means for them. And then, of course, now as a state, we have to really look at that and say, how is this going to inform our rates? Should it be the same for everyone? And we're learning a lot of very interesting things about salaries, about that it doesn't really vary by the state. So some things that you would just assume people pay people less here, or pay, some of those assumptions are not in fact true, that people are paying people the similar, but their access to resources are much different in rural parts of the state. So what does that mean for a provider in a rural part of the state, still having to pay the kind of salaries that someone in an urban part of the state where they have more access to resources? What do those kind of structural inequalities and inequities mean? And that's where the cost estimation model really helps us look at that. Small family childcare, larger group home, small centers, larger centers, mixed age, all those components that we know are so important to our early childhood professionals, and most importantly, the compensation.
Right. And I think, when you think about the new division, the new department being set up, but how do providers in the system, kind of experience that? Having one of the kind of first things being like, we are out here listening to you. And, when we have been doing the data collection with providers and having them know that, the state is interested in really understanding what it should cost to do what you're doing, and they are planning to do something about it, is a powerful kind of message, and a good kind of out the gate that we're going to try and do something about it. And to that point, the next slide kind of asks the question of, and so how are you going to pay for that? So can you talk a little bit about, the work that's been going on in the state to actually increase revenue to support this work?
Yeah. Yes, Barry, thank you, Simon. And as we said, our first strategic priority, we knew through all the voices that we're going to need more investments. Luckily, again, Governor Lujan Grisham knew that she was going to need more investments for this new department, and in her second year in office, set about creating the Early Childhood Trust Fund. So there's a lot of surplus funds coming into the state due to the oil and gas and other revenues. And so working with the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee and former Senator John Arthur Smith and Representative Doreen Gallegos in the House, they created this trust fund that put $320 million aside to say we have to grow this fund so that every year this department will be able to rely on new investments. So our first distribution from that fund comes in 22, where we get 20 million. And then every year thereafter, we are going to be able to get either 5% of the fund or 30 million, whichever is greater. And again, that fund will be invested. And we know that that is an important source of revenue. We also know that we need to look always for more federal investments, more philanthropic investments, but having the Early Childhood Trust Fund and unanimous bipartisan support on the heels of creating the new department, a legislature who said, yes, we now need to create a place for this department to get additional revenue. We are making that happen. And then this her third year, she put her support behind a decade-long endeavor to get the voters of New Mexico to be able to vote on whether a portion of our permanent land grant fund can be used to fund early childhood education. So we're very excited. Our legislature, it was not as bipartisan, but we passed just last 2 weeks ago, the House Joint Resolution 1, which is now going to take to the New Mexico voters the opportunity to say, should we invest a portion of our permanent land grant in early childhood? That will bring us, if passed, an additional $127 million a year in revenues to support our strategic priorities and to support, again, the issue of making sure all families and young children across the state have access to these quality services. So those are some of our most important. And then I think partnering, the public-private partnership that we have with the Pritzker Children's Initiative and our local early childhood funders collaborative, all of these things are helping us think about ways to bring more revenues into the state to support the department's priorities.
And is it fair to say that the work of kind of the fiscal modeling, kind of the helping
Yes.
to understand the system is kind of helping kind of make the case for this?
I mean, I don't know where I would be if we weren't doing the cost estimation modeling, and some preliminary stuff we're even seeing with our home visiting modeling is really helping us make some critical strategic decisions right now about where we need to put those investments, not just in the programs, but in the overall infrastructure of the state's quality improvement efforts. I mean, so much goes into, you could pay for your per child or per family cost for home visiting, but then it's all the supports that go into that with coaching, consultation, monitoring, support. So that has just been fantastic. And then another critical piece of the Senate Bill 22, they were very, very smart legislators and governor's staff, was saying you need to have a 4-year finance plan. This department we have to know where you're going. And Assistant Secretary can attest to all the debate that went on over the permanent land grant over this last legislative session of, and we all face it. People think that, well, you have this new department, our budget's about 410 million right now. You've got this early childhood trust fund. Like, when is enough? And I said, honestly, I mean, without even really concrete estimates, we need at least another $500 million just based on some of the access issues and the quality issues. But this is so smart that we have this 4-year fiscal plan requirement that we have to present to the legislature and the governor. We'll plan to do that here in the summer, but really giving them the information holistically. Who are the children we're trying to reach? How many of them are we reaching? What are the outcomes? What is the efficacy of these early childhood care and education programs? And then what are the recommendations for financing this whole system? I think, there's also going to need to be discussion about local investments, and some of the conversations we're having, how to leverage local, tribal, federal, state more efficiently and effectively. So we're excited to have our partners at the Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies helping guide and having these principles really have helped me personally and us as a department share this strategy and approach with our legislators, with the governor's staff. We have a lot, we know we have a lot of work to do, but we feel that what was the groundwork that was laid in Senate Bill 22 with the Assistant Secretary, the requirement of the Advisory Council, the requirement of a finance plan, really thinking deeply about what was needed to invest with the trust fund. We're well positioned because people before us thought about governance, financing, and equity as they were putting this together into legislation. And then what we've done with it since, with all of our listening sessions, strategic plan, we feel in a good place, but know that a lot of work is still to be done.
Thanks, Secretary. I'm going to share contact information and the website for the department, as I know folks are probably interested in exploring a little bit more of some of the nuts and bolts of the work that was shared. And there is one question in the chat that I wanted to raise up for both the Secretary and Assistant Secretary to reflect on as we move into just sort of a little bit of reflection in our last couple minutes before we close the event. As Elizabeth just said, that it really is the smart thinking of individuals around governance, fiscal and equity coming together demonstrates why we brought this particular state example to you, because those three things really could not have the impact of on each other without all functioning at the same time, with that thinking about system, right? Like focusing on how the system needs to function, and not just only focusing on governance or only focusing on equity, but focusing on all three of the components at once. And the question that was asked in the chat by Amanda Flannery was around whether or not, even with the kind of the early days that you're in, are there any specific bright spots that you would note? Obviously, pending revenue is certainly a bright spot, but I want to see if there was other reflections or that, or any sense of the impact on children and families from this work.
Do you want to go first, or you want me to? You go.
Trying to think. I'm really trying to think. I mean, there's so many, and I would want to say a highlight would be utilizing those local indigenous knowledge systems that were in place and that have not been utilized often, or maybe not at all. And through this department and through this position, we're able to work with those individuals that have, you know, this vast knowledge and these values that they've been ingrained for hundreds of years that can then transfer into our children to sustain us as Native people as well.
And I would say one bright spot that we've heard from the community and we've heard from families directly too is just the ability of having this department and having all these programs and services connected, is that through the pandemic, we have been able to really just stand shoulder to shoulder with the other cabinet secretaries and with our provider partners and be able to meet, you know, the needs around telehealth, around personal protective equipment, around, you know, getting differentials and waiving parent co-payments, but that their voices have been able to be heard collectively through all those different programs and services. So we have a weekly call with all early childhood community, 8 to 9 on Tuesday morning. And usually we have between 400 and 500 people join us every Tuesday. And we're able to be in communication with the entire early childhood care and education system. Of course, that's not everybody, but the leadership of those programs. And I think that through that, we've been able to adapt and change our strategy because we're able to hear from them collectively. And then doing a lot of cross-educational between, as we're fit providers are coming back into childcare, what does that mean for childcare? And so having the conversation together. And I know we've been able to really support families more holistically. And the other place is through a great campaign we funded through PDG called Moments Together. And we've been connecting directly with families through a really nice campaign about the role that they can have. But through that, we connect them with programs and services around the state, including childcare, home visiting, FIT. So we're bringing things together because we have this umbrella organization. So I don't know if that answered fully your question, Amanda, but we have we'll have a lot more bright spots a year from now. And the other thing that the Senate Bill 22 requires us to do is an annual child outcomes report, which will also be done here in this coming year. So something that we will be able to actually showcase how we have improved. And over time, we have to continue to do that report. So we have that accountability built into the governance system of our department.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, Secretary Groginsky and Assistant Secretary Archuleta. That was really great just to hear. I've been working with New Mexico for a while now, but it was great to hear it all together, certainly. So I really appreciate that. I appreciate you both taking the time to be with us today and to share with us and sharing your contact information. So if people have follow-up questions, they can reach out and seek your advice of the people who have started doing some of this work. I'm going to pass to Gina now just to wrap us up.
We just have less than a minute left, so I'm going to go pretty quick. I mentioned at the outset that we were going to be hosting office hours. And so what we're including here, and it will also be in the chat, is a link for some date options if you'd like to sign up for a 45-minute window to touch base on all things prenatal to 5 fiscal strategies, governance, and equity, all these elements together, just process where your state or community is, what you might engage in next. We're offering these opportunities. And so that's what we're sharing with that Calendly link. And we also will support you and remind you with some of the other resources that are available through the Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies website, things like the readiness assessment document. And so we're really thinking about where you are and how, if you go to a comprehensive approach, how can you weave in all of the pieces and where are you sort of suited to start the most in one particular area, but not lose sight of the opportunity to work on all of the different areas coming together. We acknowledge that there's many instances where you may be more primed in one area or another, and we can support you with thinking about how you keep a sight line to the comprehensive approach. And for folks that are Pritzker Children's Initiative grantees, don't hesitate to speak with your hub lead as well for how you might be able to access these resources also, as we know many of you are involved in Pritzker states and communities that are joining us on the webinar series as well. So we've really enjoyed this time together. Do kind of keep looking at the website because we're going to continue populating it with resources, and also keep telling us what things you need, because that's part of the goal of this initiative, is to be responsive to the field in building and reinforcing this comprehensive approach. So I echo Simon's thanks to Secretary Groginsky and Assistant Secretary Archuleta, and thank you for all of you joining us on these Wednesdays since the beginning of 2021. Don't hesitate to reach out for more.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.